My name is Shamta Hunter, and on behalf of the UBC Sustainability Initiative, I would like to welcome you to UBC Read Sustainability. I would like to acknowledge that UBC's Vancouver Point Grey campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I make this acknowledgement with a deep sense of consideration of the impacts of climate injustices on our Indigenous communities for many, many years. Although this sense of urgency might be new for some of us, it is not for many Indigenous communities who have been feeling the impacts for generations. I would also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. I will ask that you please hold on to your questions until the end of the talk, and you may use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens to ask your questions. The recordings will be archived and available at our website on sustain.ubc.ca/reads. After Sarah's talk, there will be an opportunity for a brief Q&A. At the end of the Q&A, around 4 p.m., we will invite you to join us for smaller breakout rooms to continue this conversation, connect with others in our community, and share your thoughts, interventions, and wisdom connected to climate justice. Breakout Zoom link will be offered near the end of this webinar in the chat box. I would like to thank our partners, UBC Thrive and the Pacific Institute for Climate Change Solutions, for their support in making this event happen. UBC Read Sustainability is a speaker series which aims to bring authors on relevant global and local issues to engage the UBC community in dialogue across disciplines and build connections. This is our first Zoom event, and we are very excited to have Dr. Sarah Ray here with us to talk about climate anxiety, which has been on the rise in our communities and increasingly prevalent in UBC students, staff, faculty, and community members. Sarah Jaquette Ray is an associate professor and leads the Environmental Studies program at Humboldt State University in Arcata, California. Drawing on a decade of experience leading and teaching in college environmental studies programs and combining insights from psychology, sociology, social movements, mindfulness, and the environmental humanities, Sarah explains why and how we need to let go of eco-guilt, resist burnout, cultivate resilience, and learn to desire a climate-changed future while advocating for climate justice. Her talk today, titled Coming of Age at the End of the World, an existential toolkit for the climate generation, is based on her newest book, A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, How to Keep Your Cool on a Warming Planet. Over to you, Sarah.
Thanks so much, Shamta, and thank you so much to UBC and to everybody who's shown up. I hail from traditional land of the Wiyot people, commonly known as Arcata, California, or in Wiyot, Gudini, which is translated as over in the woods. And I appreciate so much your land acknowledgement, Shamta, at the beginning of this talk. And we have Pacific Northwest regional shared history there, so I appreciate that very much. So I have an outline, no slides, so you'll have to, humor me with my outline and my talk today. I really feel, I was telling Shamta earlier that I feel pretty raw and a lot of emotions going on, and so I just wanted to be present with you and hear from you, your thoughts about what's going on. And I really want to start by kind of naming the anxiety that's in the room, since we're going to move into climate anxiety. And of course, climate anxiety, I hope I make the case that the tools and the things I think about that are in my book and that I'm thinking about for my students and young people are very relevant to all of us today within this sort of political moment, as you watch from across the northern border. And also they're really relevant to what's happening with COVID anxiety, with what's happening with the movements for racial justice in the US and internationally. And certainly I want to make the case that the tools that I've been thinking about are relevant, because climate anxiety is all those forms of anxiety. And so I hope you'll allow me or humor me as I try to make those connections. So what does the current state tell us about life in America? Is there reason for optimism amidst what seems to be a shift towards authoritarianism, anti-environmental values, racism, misogyny, and strongman forms of power? I hope that I'll be able to convince you today that the reason that we are continue to engage in this kind of work around climate justice and advocacy even before the election, through the election, and after the election is always the same, and we're grappling always with the same sources of narratives and framing that that I argue in my book are things that would really help us if we thought about differently. So I want to start, my first sort of bullet point that I want to share is why I wrote this book, A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, How to Keep Your Cool on a Warming Planet. First of all, the big reason I wrote it was because about 5 or 6 years ago, I started to have a very different experience in my classrooms with students. Having taught environmental studies and actually led environmental studies programs for a number of years, things started to feel a little different. My students started to feel more intense and serious, and they started to kind of take the content of what I was teaching them around questions like environmental racism, environmental justice, and colonialism, and white fragility, and all of these topics. I was always teaching classes on power and privilege and the environment and intersections there. And they were really getting pretty mad about the state of the world, and it was starting to become like the topic in the conversation would no longer be about a particular case study of environmental racism or some way of thinking about it, but rather the students' emotions in response to the content. And it started to feel like their emotional despair and their emotional almost nihilism at times, sort of self-erasure, desire to sort of not even exist anymore because they felt so bad about what was happening on the planet, was actually affecting my ability to teach, and it was certainly affecting their success. And indirectly or directly, it was affecting this hope I had for the planet that I would be helping produce a generation of young people who would go out and become these environmental leaders like we promise in all of our brochures. And I thought to myself, I'm going to really need to think differently if I'm going to perform this role as a teacher, this facilitator of moving students from being kind of idealistic and wanting to save the planet into actual advocates out in the world with, you know, jobs and functioning well-being lives, that I was going to have to really think differently about what and how I was teaching. And so I started to investigate much more around the research on affect theory and emotions and psychology. And I started teaching the stuff that I was reading and seeing how my students responded to it, and really beginning to increasingly center the role of students' emotions in the classroom in a way to kind of stave off the fact that students were coming to my office hours and late night emails, and I was feeling almost like an existential therapist outside of the classroom. And I actually felt like in order to save myself from drowning in that I actually had to put it in the classroom and make that the topic of our conversations and our work. And so that was sort of my first step in that direction. And then there was the 2016 presidential election. So the timing of this talk is pretty potent for me, pretty powerful, because after the 2016 presidential election, I had, as many academics I think do, and especially those of us who are, I'm from a humanities training. My field of area of expertise is the environmental humanities. And I really had this feeling of the imminent death of higher education and a real strong anti-intellectualism in our country, which I still feel this way, and a threat to higher education and especially the humanities and also the environment. And so I really had this feeling of urgency around rethinking, redefining what my role was as an academic. And so that's the reason why I felt like the best tool I had in my toolkit at that time to affect the world or to respond to what was going on was to write a public-facing book. And so I set out to try to figure out how to do that. And that's what the book that I'm talking about today, A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, is a product of. I really wanted to have a book that reached a wide audience. I didn't want to write a scholarly book that was just for my retention and promotion. And I was on the brink of getting tenure, so I felt like, okay, I can risk this, you know, because of course the structure of higher education doesn't necessarily always love it when you go write a public-facing book, but the historical moment really made me feel obliged to do that. And I was very fortunate to work with UC Press, University of California Press, who really wanted me to write the book with the audience in mind, to be younger people. And I think that was really a brilliant insight from them. And it has been a real pleasure to think of the book as actually speaking to younger people and like speaking to my students, which is the ongoing conversation that got me here in the first place. So I really, although I'm speaking to you all as if you may be students, or you may be more like me, maybe an environmental educator, or you're working in some kind of environmental activism or sustainability efforts. My hope is that my comments cross across all of our kind of demographics, but I really want to point out that I'm very interested in what young people are experiencing uniquely. So I also wanted to speak to what young people are experiencing uniquely. So young people are at least in the US, young people, Generation Z, people born after about 1996, they are the largest population in American society. They are overwhelmingly very concerned with climate change. They're the most ethnically diverse group of population in America. They're also going to be the most, they're going to live the shortest. They have the worst life expectancy as any generation has ever been before in America. And they also are going to have be worse economically than any generation before. They're the first generation to not be as well off, to be worse off than their parents, I'm sorry. So this is something that causes a lot of anxiety in young people, and you can understand why, then that the mental health profile of young people is particularly grim. Young people are the most lonely, most suicidal, most depressed, most anxious, and any of you who work with young people, who are young people in the audience, may resonate with this and think, yes, that makes a lot of sense. So this is a generation that is undergoing some significant mental health crisis, and there's a wide range of percentage, but somewhere between 45 and 75% of my students and college students across the US have experienced some form of trauma, including increasingly climate trauma. For example, in my home state, the fires. So this is something that increasingly psychologists are thinking about. I wouldn't say institutions of higher education are thinking about things like climate trauma. The language around this hasn't really developed very much, but it's really kind of my hope that this book and the work I'm doing with other people are helping to bring the sort of psychological impacts of climate change more to the fore of how we're dealing with young people, but also ourselves, with the ultimate goal, of course, being that we are supporting people to engage in climate work for the long haul, because this really is our life's work. So my feeling was at the end of sort of the story was that I needed to know much more about what the best emotional tools that young people were going to need to have, and also that I personally was going to need to have. I felt my own sense of despair and climate anxiety was really starting to affect my well-being, and my own personal journey through this research comes through in the book, I hope. And therefore, I often feel a little nervous saying, try this tool, try this thing, because if it just worked for me, it may not work for you. So I want to have that always as a caveat, that this isn't sort of a one-size-fits-all set of tools. So my hope for the book and for young people and for all of us is a little bit strange and different than maybe what we're all feeling in this very moment. But I really do imagine, this fantasy of mine is that we kind of reinvent the environmental movement and the climate justice movement to be much more about emotions that are really pleasurable, right? Like joy and desire. And that the negative emotions that we feel around climate justice, fear, anxiety, trauma, loss, mourning, grief, that these are all harnessed and used in an intelligent way, drawing on the research about how we can activate that into really effective work for the planet. And so the role of emotions is central to the work we can do in the long haul. It's not just a secondary thing that we're navel gazing, woe is me. We will simply not be able to do the work we need to do for climate justice for the long haul if we do not seriously engage the role of emotion in political, social, and personal behavior change and action. Secondarily, a sort of a second purpose of the book was that I really wanted to convince environmental educators in particular that they needed to bring in these insights from psychology, from social movements, and of course from the environmental humanities, which has a lot to say about the power of story, the importance of how we frame things, how identity plays into environmental politics, these kinds of things, and that those things really needed to shape our syllabi and our curriculum and what we thought we were doing in the classroom. Because as many environmental educators know, and as I experienced, without doing that, what we end up doing is sort of using the same narrative around climate urgency, just sort of throwing a lot of data at them, throwing a lot of science at them, telling them how terrible things are, and then hoping they'll translate that into action on their own outside of the classroom. And there's an assumption that we inform them, and then therefore they go do something. And it turns out that as social psychologists are showing, that doesn't actually work that way. And I want to get into that a little bit later in this talk too, but that if we don't actually bring these insights around how psychology affects our students, we're not actually going to have the results that we expect we're having when we're in the classroom. So a secondary kind of audience or purpose of my work is really to enable environmental educators to think differently about how important emotion is and how we can kind of create the emotional outcomes in what we do in the classroom and also in co-curricular activities to activate and energize and sustain young people in that activism for the long haul. So we need to harness this research better. Okay, so I want to kind of go on a little segue right now where I talk about COVID as climate anxiety, because a lot of people have asked me since I published the book in the middle of COVID coming out. So the book's release date was April 22nd, which is Earth Day. And it came under the cloud of COVID. And of course I was supposed to come to Vancouver and give this talk on, I think it is late March or something, and had to cancel. So I'm here now, but COVID is the reason for this. And I really want to make the case, and I probably don't have to make the case as strongly with you all as I might have to with other audiences, but I really want to make the case that COVID anxiety is climate anxiety. And so when COVID happened, after implementing a lot of these strategies in my own teaching, I was so grateful because we could immediately take just one step of logic and say, okay, students, this is your test, right? The things we've been learning are now coming to pass. How are you going to show up in this? And so I'm really grateful that I had been studying this stuff and practicing this stuff, because for some students, climate trauma was actually happening to them at different stages in the last 5 years or so. But for many students, they weren't actually experiencing the impact of what we think of as on the horizon for climate change for many people. Not for everybody, but for many people. And COVID kind of made it right front and center, and it all of a sudden brought it to very close and right in front of us. Something that we could feel in our economy, something we could feel in our bodies, something that we could have a lot of fear about, something that we watch people around us and whole structures around us completely change before our eyes. And that was the kind of stuff that, frankly, students had been learning about and studying about in their classes. What's going to happen when climate crisis happens? How are we going to have to reinvent everything that we know? And that imagination about the future has something that they were practicing for, and to connect the dots between what was happening in the moment with COVID and what we had been studying didn't take too much effort. Additionally, COVID itself is a manifestation of climate change. And so scientists for a long time have been talking about predicting greater and greater increases of infectious disease and really calling for us to reframe climate change as a crisis of public health. So these types of arguments have been made by folks who have been concerned about climate change for some time. And as we know, climate change itself is sort of imperceptible to the human body. It happens over a temporal and long period of time that is a little bit imperceptible. It's one of the reasons why climate change, as climate communicators have long argued, is really hard to get people to care about, because it's not something we can really perceive. It doesn't fit any of the risk categories for what people can perceive as a threat. So all those sort of boxes you can tick off for how do you get people to worry about something, climate change is not like a hostile invader. It sort of happens over a long period of time. It doesn't fit any of the risk categories for risk perception. And so we're only going to ever be able to perceive climate change through its proxies, through the sort of effects of climate change, including things like infectious diseases and extreme weather events and increased heat and that sort of thing. So I think it's a really, one of the very few silver linings about COVID is it has raised the specter of climate change manifesting in these ways, and that what we need to be doing to think about climate change is the same stuff that we need to be doing to think about COVID. And I think that that's an effective argument. Another thing that I think is really interesting, parallels between kind of preparing for COVID and preparing for climate change and the anxiety that comes with that, is that they both bring up the point and reveal very, starkly that the role of community resilience and social capital and trust within and among communities is really important to function and for resilience. And so there have been studies that show that community trust is actually more effective dollar per dollar as you invest in it than any kind of physical infrastructure in order to help a community bounce back from a natural disaster. And so when we think about what that means for us, if that means that we shift all of our efforts towards thinking about how do we practice building community with our students, it is a fundamentally radically different type of pedagogy, and it also is a different level content that we're thinking about teaching. And so in the response to COVID, one thing we're thinking about is how is it that we can maintain and keep fostering community even with all of these virtual settings? And that's something that lots of people are asking, but quite fundamentally, the need for community is so starkly revealed when it's been sort of stripped away from everybody having to be socially isolated. And so I think there's another silver lining there, that when you actually reveal all the sort of house of cards that all of these things are built on and how important these things are, we're seeing how important things like social reproduction is to make an economy function. We're seeing how important family life is and how the division of labors in family life are still remain really unequal, and how even the nuclear family structure is fundamentally, a very weak family structure, a weak structure for community resilience. And that none of these sort of forms of isolated atomistic social organizations is really going to work in the future. It's not working for COVID, and it's probably not going to work for climate change. And so there's a lot of really great conversations about what could possibly be that COVID is bringing up, because those are the same questions that climate activists and advocates have been thinking about for some time. Okay, so I want to shift now to ask the question, why should we focus on emotion? Why is it so important for thinking about all of these crises? One of the reasons why is because intelligence about the role of emotion in decision-making will make us better at persuading others to care about what we care about. And so this is a sort of strategic instrumentalist kind of cold way of thinking about the role of emotion and why we should care about it. But I start with this because it's kind of the most convincing one for people who are like, oh, that's just soft skills. We don't really need that. So I want to give an example. Some of the research I did for my book, and I describe in the book, is something called the Pseudo-Inefficacy Hypothesis. And then the Pseudo-Inefficacy Hypothesis, the notion there is that if we if we think that we cannot have an effect or have an impact on something, we're not likely to even try to engage in that. And the experiment that was used to get to this conclusion is something called the child in the pond experiment. And it basically goes that when a person sees a child in a pond drowning, they're instinctively very likely to want to go and rescue the child in the pond. But if they see a child in the pond drowning in front of them, and they also see another child in the pond drowning a little bit farther beyond, because there's two, they're actually less likely to want to even try to rescue the one child that's in front of them. This notion that the problem is so big that we can't make a difference is really damaging to the climate justice movement. And many of us, especially my students, have really believed and swallowed the notion that they don't have any power, that they're just one person to act in the world. And I call this the apathy trap in my book, and people have called different names. It's something that I'm sure we all have felt, and many of our students often feel, why would I do anything when I know that I'm just a drop in the bucket? And this notion of just the drop in the bucket imaginary is really damaging. But it is an emotional thing, and it can be countered by emotional intelligence. And so that's just one example. We are not actually going to act in our best interests if we think it won't make a difference. And so tricking ourselves into thinking it will make a difference, or reframing where and how it does make a difference, challenging narratives of our powerlessness, challenging narratives of us acting alone in the world as one small person. Those kinds of things will really make a difference in our sense of efficacy in the world. And that's one of the sort of mind-blowing things that when I discovered that, I thought, oh, this is something I can do something about. I might not be able to change laws, but I can do this work. Another reason is that when we are triggered and this is where the sort of, neuroscience and the sort of brain psychologists have come in to really help me a lot, is that when parts of our brain that are really triggered around fight, flight, or freeze, the amygdala is not helping us make rational decisions. And so when we're in a state of agitation or dysregulation, we're less likely to actually think through the consequences of our decisions. We're less likely to figure out what the real root cause of a problem is. We're much more likely to act impulsively and waste a lot of energy. And I think that's one of the things that I've been really thinking about. It's not that we all need to get really emotional and cry and rage about what's going on in the world. That's not necessarily what I'm calling for. Neither am I saying that those emotions are bad and we shouldn't have them. On the contrary, they're important, and I'll get to that in a minute. But having intelligence about what's happening to our bodies with emotions enables us to actually make the most rational decisions. And that kind of feels counterintuitive, right? The more we understand emotion, the more rational we can be. Emotions also matter much more in decision-making than reason or logic. And this is something that when I first started learning this, I thought, this is crazy. We live in a world that is, this Cartesian Western dualistic thinking that says that the mind is superior and that anything else, subjectivity in the body and all that, those senses and those kinds of intuitions are not as valuable. And I really have found it very interesting that even in a world that thinks of reason as so prioritized and so paramount, emotions still actually are proven to be a more powerful effect in social psychologists' research on decision making. So data, which everyone says they always want, show me the facts, I want the facts, this kind of discourse that's happening in the US right now around facts and alternative facts and the science, and I believe scientists, I'm drawing on science, all of this sort of performance of objectivity is just proving what I'm talking about. But it turns out that data and science, in fact, doesn't actually make people change their behavior or take action. And the fact that none of those arguments seem to be working for either party is an example of that. I find it fascinating. So we need to think about how powerful emotions are in people's decision-making and not just keep pouring data on them, pouring information. I find this is very interesting with many of my students who come in, and they sort of have that view, the same as my previous view as an educator, that if we just inform people more, if they just get more educated, if they just get more information about this, they will then make the right decisions and have the right values. And I think that that's a really dangerous assumption. It's not working for us. And Kari Norgaard in Living in Denial, a wonderful book that I draw on from my research, she calls this the information deficit myth, that there's this myth that people just are having a deficit of information, and if we just provide it, they'll, things will all lock in and go as we need. This reliance and this sort of over-attachment to data and objectivity and facts is actually ineffective. Another thing is that the sort of psychologists show that people keep coming back to do things that make them feel good. And so most environmental messaging that I've ever heard of, and that I think dominates the environmental movement since the 1960s, is about feeling worse about yourself, right? Like, you are making too much of an impact, you need to reduce your impact, you are doing all these awful things on the planet. The ecological footprint exercise is intended to make you feel guilt, and it is intended to make you think about what you can cut and deprive yourself of. And a lot of people don't want to become environmentalists because they don't want to have to sacrifice and stop eating meat and not having all these pleasures. And so I think that this leads to a sense of self-erasure that is really evident in my students, to the point where I sort of worry about them having suicidal ideation. And that sort of level of intense existential self-loathing and misanthropy is just a powerful emotion that underpins much environmental messaging. And I think this is very dangerous. And I want us to really think through about how we can use positive emotions to attract more people to this cause, and also to keep more people engaged and not erasing themselves. We need them around to make these positive impacts on the planet. Another reason why emotion is so important is that with climate, there's a lot of negativity around the way it's framed. So there's mostly about 80 to 85% of news about climate change is framed in a negative frame. Bad things are happening. The apocalypse is on the horizon, tipping points, all this sort of frames around climate change. And from a narratological perspective, there are certain traits about the way that the narrative around climate change is framed, that people who study narrative are really thoughtful about, right? That what is something like that kind of narrative psychologically do to people who are receiving that message? And it turns out that that negative frame can often become a self-fulfilling prophecy, that if we believe that we are living in a story that is of decline, we are more likely to not act in our self-preservation. And so I go into this at length in the book. It might feel counterintuitive to you, and I'm happy to take questions on that. But I find that very, very fascinating, that the story that we live in is essential for how it is that we act. And also, our brains are attracted to negative information. So we have something in our brains even that is called the negativity bias, that is a residual survival skill to make sure that we are not, getting killed by the next, animal or whatever it is. And so there's a sort of perfect storm of compounding negativity biases, both in the news and in our own minds, that attracts itself to negative information that in fact isn't always true and undermines our best efforts. And so this is where I'm really thinking about, and I draw on, and I know he's pretty controversial, but I really am interested in Steven Pinker's work here and Hans Rosling's work, thinking about what damage it does to our best efforts if we actually fail to counterbalance a lot of the negative news that we consume and perpetuate with positive stories of how change is happening. And so one of the things I do with my students is it's not just therapy sessions with my students, don't get me wrong. We do things like design assignments around solutions journalism and finding solutions and interviewing people who are doing good things in the community. And if we don't have examples of that, there are two things that go wrong. First of all, we don't see models of how to do it. We continue to sit there and think we're powerless and there's no solution. But if we see around us all the time people enacting solutions and we can model ourselves from it, that is a sense of participating in positive impact, and that has a real positive feedback loop about making people engage even more. That goes to that efficacy point I made earlier. But secondly, we also live in the story that the world is really a terrible place, and that, like these scholars I mentioned, can actually have really bad consequences, not just for ourselves personally, but for the causes that we care about. So another thing that I think is really fascinating about what psychology or what emotion brings to the table is this notion of risk perception theory. And I mentioned earlier that climate is like the perfect non-risk. Climate change is just this thing that no politicians and nobody can seem to really get their teeth on. And it's designed for people not to care about. And so I think that the folks who are doing a lot of work on how do we reframe climate change to get people to care about it has really been influential for helping me think about it. And they're mostly folks are in the realm of communication. So another reason emotions are super important is that they matter as indicators for us. In America, at least, American culture, we're trained to pursue happiness and avoid discomfort. And capitalism is very happy to oblige. We can shop or swipe or pay to have our attention taken away from the things that are freaking us out and put on stuff that, is just quick dopamine hits, right? But of course, this avoidance and denial is it will actually perpetuates the problems that we're trying to avoid. So that's one big reason why we need to actually pay attention to the anxiety that we feel around this. Also, that the pain and the sort of grief that we feel. I mean, I've been sitting here thinking about grief for the last few days. What do I feel is lost in this moment? Listing it out, it's kind of a painful exercise, right? But what it helps us do, and anybody who studies grief in this room, in this virtual room, this will make sense to you, that grief is love having no place to go. So if love has no place to go, and that's why we're feeling grief, what is that thing that we're loving? What is that object of love? And what is it that we can do to sort of, instead of feeling and wallowing in grief, turn that grief into actions to protect that thing that we love? So my favorite mantra right now along those lines, amidst so much negative news and so much anxiety that I've been feeling in the last 8 months or so, but even before that, is something that I get from Adrienne Maree Brown's book, Emergent Strategy. This is a book that powerfully shaped my thinking about 4 or 5 years ago when I first read it. And she has a section in her book called Feed What You Want to Grow. And that is actually the final chapter of my book. When I wake up in the morning and I feel overwhelmed by all this stuff that I have no control over, that I wish very much was different, and that the news is feeding me, my attention is grabbed by all of this shock and horror, I really have to discipline myself again to go back to the positive stories, to go back to the things that I want to grow, to go to what grief is indicating to me I love. And I have also kind of taken a deep dive into something that has been a big role in my life since I was in college. And Buddhists often quote Buddha as saying, whatever you think and ponder will become the inclination of the mind. And I really take this to heart, that where I put my attention is what will become real in the world for me. And I think that that's one of the biggest insights that I am sharing now. It's not rocket science, but in this moment of such terrible negative news, it's really the best thing I can offer my students. So I'll just speak relatively quickly about the chapters in my book. The chapters in the book and the way the book is organized is that each chapter is a tool in the toolkit. And there are things like sort of what I just described. They expand on the things I just described. For example, becoming climate aware of the climate, emotions around climate change and why they're so important. The second chapter is something called Cultivate Climate Wisdom. And that's about thinking about, for ourselves, how do we personally use our awareness of emotion to be okay to do this work for the long haul. So one is sort of looking outward. How do we know how emotion works on us? And then how do we cultivate in our own selves the right kinds of emotions to do this work? And attend to the grief, of course. Another one of the chapters I think is super important in this moment is called Hack the Story. And this has to do with the power of narrative in how we act. And I mentioned that earlier. But I think that what I find so fascinating is that the stories that we're consuming, the mainstream stories, are really depicting, especially right now in America, the country is black and white. And when I talk to my students about what's happening in America right now with the red and the blue and the divisions, there's this real sense of otherness and a real sense of not being able to understand even shades of gray in between, and that there's just really uncomplicated, unnuanced categories of people, and it's either black or white. And I think that that's a real product of social media and the way that media has shaped our perspectives of each other, and of course the last 4 years of a leader in office who perpetuates that too. But I think that that kind of thinking is a real problem, and we need to resist that in the best ways that we can. And I actually write about that at length in my book, which of course I was thinking about because of the last election. So another thing that I want to be thinking about, that I'm not going to go all the chapters, but one of the things I think I wanted to pull out was the need to really reinvent the environmental movement, and the climate justice movement is seeking to do this because, in large part, because it's led by young people, to be all about cultivating an imagination about the future. Because one of the things that I did with my students a couple of years ago, which was extremely depressing, and it really made me realize how dangerous things were with them, was I did a visioning exercise where I asked students to close their eyes if they felt comfortable doing that and think about 20 years ahead, what kinds of world that they would live in. All of the great work has come to pass. The utopia is manifest, right? I had sort of this, wacky visioning exercise where they lived in the utopia that they were hoping for. And then I asked them to think about what role they had played in helping to create that utopia. And the purpose of this exercise was to help empower them to think through what their very next steps, or most elegant next steps, could be, and get them into that place of empowerment. But we couldn't even get past the first question about what this utopia would look like, because they didn't even have an imagination for what that would look like. And I thought that maybe they were lazy, or that I was kind of mad at them for not being able to imagine this. Like, do you have kids? Is your air clean? Like, what is your life like, And I realized in thinking this through and talking it through with them that they don't have an imagination for the future, because all they have been taught is to fear the future. And simply put, if you cannot imagine a future you desire, you will never take those very first steps to get there. And I think that that's kind of the main punchline. If students think about, if they're motivated by fear of the future, if they're motivated by guilt about what they've done to the planet, if they're motivated by imminent doom and urgency, they are much less likely to take those very first steps. And so this is where I turn to thinking about things like desire, abundance, pleasure, humor, the notion that joy is a form of resistance, and all of these kinds of wonderful insights that come out of mostly civil rights and indigenous sovereignty movements, actually. So I think I'm going to sort of wrap up there. I want to really drive home the point that we need to reinvent the climate movement to be something that is pleasurable, and that this moment really calls us to do that. It's not that we're denying the seriousness or the fear, but that really that is a form of the resistance. And how we feel is very important, even if it is true that we are all powerless, that we are all too small, that bad things are inevitable. What should we do then about that? You know, I mean, denial and distraction and numbing is not really an option either. And so the only place that gets me, is to despair and self-destruction. And so my question for you all as I wrap up is to think that if you have one precious life on this planet, we would like it to feel good, right? I mean, we don't want to spend the whole time on the planet working for something that we know we'll never see come to pass and feel terrible about that. So the process itself has to be the point. Diving into grief and despair has actually helped me cherish my life more, ironically, and find much more pleasure in the work. And so my question to you is, even in the face of terrible evidence, how will you show up for your life and for the planet? And so thank you. That's the end of my time.
Thank you, Sarah. That was such a thought-provoking and inspirational talk. Thank you for that. We do have some questions coming in the Q&A, so I'll read them to you and you can take it from there. We have from Kevin, how should the climate movement push back against long-held, historically racist and eugenistic ideas such as overpopulation that are major contributor to climate anxiety?
Yeah, I think that's such a great question. I think that that's also coming up in a lot of the debates that are happening right now around the birth strikers, and zero population growth is kind of coming up again in conversations with the next generation, right? And my feeling is that there's still a debate, there's still disagreement in the climate movement. There's sort of an older generation of the climate movement and a younger generation of the climate movement who occupy different positions here in this debate, which is about, can we get to fix climate change without addressing social injustice? Or will addressing social injustice actually distract us from the work of climate change? And there's no point even doing that, because we can't have social justice if we don't have a planet, right? So I hear this debate happening in my classes all the time, and I almost stage the debate. And I think that that's where one way we can combat that is to put that debate everywhere we see it, right? Like, let's have this conversation. Of course, I have my where I want to go with that. I don't want students to come out thinking, there's no time for social justice, climate change is so urgent, right? I want them to come out thinking we cannot have climate change we can't address climate change without addressing social injustice, including things like eugenicist values. I mean, my first book actually in 2013 was The Eugenicist Roots of American Environmental Thought. So I am really hopped up on thinking about how environmentalism is a racist movement, right? That's how I got into studying environmental studies. I was doing women's studies and critical race theory before I was doing environmental work. So I got into environmental work as a way to understand racism better, which is unusual. I think most people kind of get into the environment first and then think, oh yeah, social justice is also a good idea. You know, maybe I'll think about that too. But I think that that conversation has not been resolved. And I think we just need to stage that debate all the time. Young people are leading the way. Young people are not accepting this. You know, Greta Thunberg and all of the other climate youth activists that we've seen in the last couple of years all say the same thing. They're all saying these things are connected. They're all seeing social injustice and racial injustice and global, global inequality and indigenous, continued on in neocolonialism as functions of environmental degradation. And so they don't see them as separated. And so once that generation starts to dominate the discourse, I think we'll see something else. But I think staging that conversation, pushing it all the time is the answer. I mean, in my settings, holding conversations is the way to do that. Publishing work, how everybody else does it in their own settings, I think is different. But it is utterly, if anything, that the racial justice movements that have happened since George Floyd's murder has taught the climate movement was already pretty hipped up on justice questions, but now there's no turning back, and I think it's fantastic. I mean, it really started in 2015 or so, but I think it's here to stay. I'm encouraged.
Thank you. We have a question from Emily. Curious to hear your thoughts about older millennials. I am one, and I remember feeling hopeful, like I could do something to make a difference when I was in my teens, but I don't anymore. I'm 36. From what you described, I don't think it's just cynicism. How do we overcome these feelings?
Yeah, God, I wish I could offer a really straightforward solution, and I'm sure you've spent a lot of time already trying to overcome that. I don't pretend that I can answer that question, and I spend half my time in the same state. So I might be saying some things to everybody here, but it's hard. It's a daily practice. One of the things that has worked for me, and I do write about in the book, is that if I just accept that the worst is all happening, I ended on this note, but I'm not sure I really unpacked it. If I accept that the worst is actually happening, and it actually frees me up to not rely on hope as my main thing. I guess I'm gonna just keep doing this work for some other reason, you know? And I really love how different people have theorized different types of hope. So there's not just one kind of hope. Hope can be, in a negative way, it can be kind of sugar-coated Pollyanna deferral of responsibility onto the future, onto somebody else. Like, I have hope that someday somebody will fix that in the future. And I think that that kind of hope is not genuine. It doesn't incite action and actually excuses people from getting involved. And I think that that's maybe hope isn't the point. And this is where I do actually really love what Greta Thunberg says about hope, but also lots of scholars have been thinking about hope in really deep and critically interesting ways. Instrumentalist hope, they call that. That cynical hope is instrumentalist hope. But other folks call a different kind of hope, spiritual hope, or other types of variations on that, that the hope is the byproduct of the work, right? So it's sort of like, you know, you can't put the cart before the horse. You can't use hope to generate the reason why you're going to do what you're going to do. Hope has to come as a byproduct of something else that you're thinking, another way of thinking about things. And that's what's helped me, right? I've said, I'm going to give up hope. What happens if I give up hope? Well, I'm not going to just go jump off a cliff. I got to have some reason to wake up and do something in the morning. So let me find out what the other reason is. And then I find out that other reason, and then that gives me a sense of kind of weird, cautious optimism. I forget who says it, but there's optimism of the heart and pessimism of the intellect, or whatever. I like that too. That's another kind of variation on it, you know? Like, I don't have any evidence that any of this is going to do any good, but I have to do it anyway.
Thank you. We have a question with a couple of words here from Juno. Hey Sarah, wonderful talk, thank you. I study English literature and I'm specifically interested in the ways that stories and the ongoing storytelling, retelling, interpretation, and reinterpretation of stories can influence pro-social action and shape the future in real time. I'm curious if you see storytelling as commodity, i.e. novels, TV shows, movies, etc., as being a primary problem in terms of hindering storytelling's ability to positively influence people. Might a resurgence of oral storytelling practices, or even transformative works like fan fiction, for example, help us to imagine a more just future rather than having a prescribed present that is simultaneously sold as an inevitable static future?
That's one of those questions that's like an argument packed into a question. I like that one. I was like, let me answer it. Stop. I want to answer. That's such a good question. That is a very good question. I love it. I love it. I mean, you already know your answer, I can tell. But my feeling is that I really love Rob Nixon's work here on slow violence and the environmentalism of the poor is his title of his book. And in that book, he basically is arguing for new narrative frameworks to get us to actually grasp the slow violence of climate change and other forms of slow violence. And so, and then let me unpack that a little bit. Slow violence, he articulates slow violence as the reason why he uses the word violence is because he wants people to start thinking about violence not just happening in these spectacular, you know, dramatic events like a brawl or something, but that violence can happen in these very slow, iterative, almost invisible ways, and that yet they're still forms of violence, right? So that the fact that they're slow and the fact that they're almost invisible and that they don't capture media attention so nobody ever hears about it makes people not think of it as a problem. And so he puts the word violence on it to say, this is actually a form of violence because there is an actor doing this to somebody. and we need to hold that accountable. And the way we hold that accountable, he says, is that we have to write better stories. We have to figure out completely new structures of narrative. And oral tradition is certainly one. Sci-fi or cli-fi is certainly another. Speculative future fiction is a whole other that's getting new attention in ways since COVID, really, that it ever has, right? Octavia Butler's Parable of Sower is on the New York Times bestseller list for the first time since she wrote it, and it's like, oh, now people are paying attention, right? So I absolutely think that narrative frames, that climate injustice is really, really impossible to capture in the narrative frames that are available to us, as you say, as a commodity. The commoditized forms of narrative that people go out and buy because they like it, even news, doesn't tell these stories. Neither do they tell the stories of slow change and slow positive solution making, right? Problem solving. So for the same reasons I'm arguing, yes, we desperately need different kinds of stories, because, and this is where I go back to Joanna Macy's work around which story we live in affects our decision making. Are we going to live in a story where we are collectively together unfolding a wonderful future ahead of us? What does that enable us to do if we think of ourselves living in that story? Versus, are we living in a story where everything is getting more and more and more isolationist and evil and violent and fearful and insecure, unfolding towards some kind of apocalypse? And so that, which story we live in is very important, but it turns out that that former story is very, very difficult to tell in the existing narrative structures that are available to us.
Great, thanks. I have a question from Karen. Why do you think it has taken us, the climate movement, this long to integrate psychology and hope into our approach?
These are such great questions. These are my favorite questions. Okay, so this one is one of my favorites because I keep thinking, why is the environmental field so slow on this? Like, why have some of the other fields really figured this out? Like, I collaborated with a lot of our critical race and gender and sexuality studies folks and our Native American studies folks and all of these different departments across my campus and in my field. They seem to have much better, they have a whole robust, huge scholarship on resilience, and they have a whole robust scholarship on trauma, and they bring that stuff into the classroom. And it's like, okay, where are the environmental folks? I mean, is it because environmental studies students are not traumatized? They're all white. Don't have histories of being oppressed. They, this is possibly have something to do with it. And this goes back to my research from before about what's up with the environmental movement. Why has it had such a racist history, this legacy? And I think that's part of it. The legacy of the environmental movement being an extremely privileged movement, or the dominant environmental movement, I should say. Many movements for the environment have been happening for a long time. They just haven't been registered as environmental movements. So, there's been an actual, structural reason related to sort of its racist legacy for why it is it hasn't taken on the psychology, because the practitioners of the movement have not, had to ever deal with the fact that they are suffering these kinds of things. And I think the climate, once you had young people connecting environmental racism and social injustice with climate change, that was the big step that was needed to say, actually, these things that we're experiencing in our daily lives that are products of capitalist exploitation and disposability of our bodies and our lives is connected to that thing over there called climate change that the polar bear people have cared about for so long. And they're taking over that movement, right? They are redefining those movements' priorities. And frankly, I think a lot of young people and who used to go into environmental fields often went into environmental fields because they felt like, there was the kind of pastoral trope of wilderness that imbued environmental studies, right? Environmental studies is still considered to be a field that's all about studying plants and animals and ecosystems and not people. I mean, that assumption is still extremely prevalent. Ask me, because I'm a humanist and people keep asking me for scientific knowledge and I don't have it. I'm like, I do environmental work, but I don't have a knowledge about an ecosystem. That dualism that's inherent even in the discipline is a function of the dualism between environment and human that exists in Western thought. it also perpetuates this notion that if you go into environmental fields, you won't have to muck around with the messiness that is human life. Lots of young people go into thinking that they're going to study environmental studies or environmental sciences because they're going to escape society, right? They love to be in nature. They love the pastoral retreat away from the messiness of human emotion and the messiness of politics and the messiness of identity and the messiness of all the scripts that society wants to give them and to be evil and bad. And so the misanthropy that's inherent in a lot of the environmental, historically in the environmental movement means that lots of people go into environmental fields because they don't really want to talk about psychology. They want to escape it, but I think that's changing. I have not met one young person who's come into my classroom in the last 5 years who doesn't deeply, deeply want to use these tools my argument recently has been, unlike the students from before who were trying to escape humanity, who thought humanity was the problem, young people now think that humanity is the solution. And this is a radical change.
Great, thanks. So we have questions for maybe time for a couple more questions. So if you are interested, please vote for other questions that are already being asked. So we have a question for Sharon. It is difficult to confront our complicity in harm, and people might want to turn away in search of what is pleasurable. But what if part of what is needed for us to interrupt our pleasure-seeking behavior in order to center our responsibilities to one another and to the planet, so that we might learn to live together differently on a finite planet?
Yes. So I may have come across as saying that pleasure is the only answer. And what you're pointing out is that actually pleasure is what got us into this trouble in the first place. And I absolutely agree. I think that there's an important distinction between turning and I cut this out of my talk, but the sense of being part of a larger purpose is super important for a feeling of deep, true happiness. So this is where the scholars on happiness are really important to me, that dopamine is not the answer to happiness. That's not the kind of pleasure seeking that we want to be doing, because that is actually a form of distraction from the difficulty of the emotions of grief and anxiety that would come if we actually face what's going on. So I utterly agree with you. However, what happens when we turn that work of engaging the saving of the planet work, right? When we turn that work into something that is also pleasurable and we want to come back for more and is part of a community and we're getting all of our juice from that, the work resources us. I see this happen when my students stop separating their friend life and their relaxation time with their school time. There's something happens around junior year where all of their extracurricular activities and their time with their friends becomes one with their studies and their passions. And that is like the aha epitome of success moment, right? Because no longer do they think of this one thing as kind of eating the spinach, and over there, that thing as being the chocolate. The chocolate and the spinach become one, right? Like the work becomes the pleasure. And that really requires that sense of being part of a larger purpose. And I'm drawing here on David Kessler's work on grief, where he adds the 6th stage of grief as being about meaning making. And whether or not you like Kubler-Ross's stages of grief or you believe in any of that, doesn't matter. Meaning making, having a sense of purpose, turns out to be far more an indicator of whether someone's going to have well-being and resilience. Forget happiness, right? Pleasure is the point of happiness and pleasure is to have that other stuff. So I think there's an important distinction there. I don't just mean like quick dopamine hits that help us avoid what's happening.
Okay, we will take maybe 2 more questions. So one is from an anonymous person. I very much relate to the fear and anxiety you mentioned, one of which is not knowing if I want a family because of this fear of now knowing if I will make it to the age of having a family. How do you think we can start getting past this fear and to stop making choices based on fear or the unknown?
Oh. Yes. I don't have a good answer for that. And I don't think I can rescue you from that. In part because I think that your fear is very legitimate and it's a reasonable, rational response to what we're living in. So I want to validate your fear before I continue. Okay. So yes, right. I mean, I've started to have my existential fear about the future around climate about a year into having my first child. And I thought, what have I done? You know, like, can we reverse time? You know, so I am very sympathetic. And I also really respect and admire many young people's, not just because they fear the future, but because they want to reinvent, they want to reject the division of labors and the invisible labor and gendered stuff that's happening in our society. They want to reinvent kinship. They want to reinvent community. They want to reinvent the village, you know, and they don't see structures in which they will be supported to do that. And they having children without that feels too frightening. And I think that's really an indictment of at least in the US, our healthcare system, frankly. I mean, there's structural reasons for your fear. And so I think instead of thinking of your fear as just existential, it'd be helpful to to compartmentalize the dimensions of it around things that there are things we can do to address and fix, and things that are simply just legitimate, fair responses to the state of the planet. And I do think some of it's structural. In other countries, people are not so worried about having support in doing this because there are structures that support them, both cultural and political structures. But that said, what you're talking about is sort of this larger picture of sort of this existential fear of, you know, I can't even imagine my future, like those students I mentioned, I described. And, you know, I wish I could say that even after that experience, I had an answer, but I do really think, and you can reject this as just Pollyanna, but if we don't manifest the world that we desire as soon as we can right now, today, we have already lost the fight. And there's all kinds of good reason for despair. Of course there's despair. Of course that future is grim. But if we don't actively feed what we want to grow today and manifest the world we want today, then when is it going to happen? Are we going to wait till the revolution is over and then do it? Are we going to wait till the revolution's over and everything is fixed and all the carbon's out of the air, and then we can have children, and then we can carry on, and then we can be happy, and then we can party and dance and celebrate and have joy? So my feeling is, what are the things that you're going to need to do to feel like you're living a full life? You simply have to do those things. And one of those things, I'm assuming, because I'm assuming you're like my audience, right? My audience is young people who are already totally hopped up on the Kool-Aid that the planet is about to die, right? They have resist tattooed all over their bodies, right? I mean, I am with you and with them. But part of what's going to make you feel that, I assume that part of what's going to make you feel that sense of purpose is continuing to engage in this important advocacy work. It's not like you're checking out when you say, oh no, it's not like a choice. I'm going to go be happy with my life and have pleasure, or I'm going to be depriving of everything and go and do the hard work. On the contrary, if we're not actually living out, existing, feeding what we want to grow, manifesting the worlds we want, then we're not actually doing that work.
Right. So one more question, and we'll take maybe 1 minute to answer this if we can, and then we'll move on to the breakout rooms. This is from Lindsay. I feel like the present moments of grief and hope are a really teetering dynamic. For example, the election right now. We are at a moment with so much potential for change, but also a real fear that this will fail to manifest. Can you speak to balancing those two extremes? Can we hold the middle ground, and how can we maintain resilience when we are disappointed?
Yeah, I just think we sometimes need to allow ourselves to not feel resilient and just be disappointed. You know, I am really a product of the American sort of aversion to discomfort. And I spend my life in what Buddhist mindfulness folks call the trance, where I'm having aversion and grasping all the time. I'm not kind of released from that most of the time. And my feeling around that is that if I am just accepting in a non-judgmental way of the fact that it feels really hopeless, you know, that I get more comfortable with it, and I actually can see more clearly what I can do next. And so I think it's not about avoiding or getting away from or stopping to feel the bad feelings. It's not so black and white. It's not like if we feel hopeful and good and positive and happy, we will then continue and engage in the work. On the contrary, if we get a healthy relationship with how crappy it is, then we'll be able to engage in the work and even maybe find pleasure and happiness and hope. And it's a non-dualistic, unconventional way of thinking about negative feelings that I think is very not Western, right? I mean, it's not the way I was raised. It's a radical new way of thinking about things. And I still find myself wanting to be dualistic about things.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm going to paste, if your questions weren't got answered, but there's more chances in the breakout rooms, and Sarah will be joining us there as well. So please join us in the breakout room. The information is in the chat box right now. I would like to thank all of you for joining us, and especially Sarah for the amazing talk and answering all those questions so well. I also wanted to thank Karen Taylor for being my tech support here today. We'll follow up with a brief survey with everyone who registered just to get your feedback on how to make these events even better. And please join us at the breakout rooms to continue the conversation. Sarah, again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everybody. I'll see you on the other side.
See you on the other side.